Election Day now 106 days away, and for the first time in Florida, more than 1 million potential new voters. Convicted felons, like 54-year-old Judy Bolden, who lost her voting rights after she was convicted for drug trafficking. Now free, she plans to vote for the first time in her life.
I know what it made me feel like. It made me feel worthless, like I wasn't even a citizen of the United States.
Because you could not vote?
Because I couldn't vote. My voice couldn't be heard.
And now?
And now I feel vindicated.
Not so fast, says Florida Governor Ron DeSantis.
Those are the things that are being litigated.
He challenged a state constitutional amendment that automatically restored voting rights, except for felons who committed murder or sexual battery. Florida had been among 11 states, making it difficult for felons to ever vote again. But 2 years ago, a majority of Floridians reversed course, restoring voting rights after felons completed all terms of their sentence. The governor says all terms means just that.
If you were robbed and someone's convicted of taking, $3,000 out of your house and they were ordered to pay you $3,000 of restitution and they didn't do it, did they complete the sentence?
Last Thursday, the U.S. Supreme Court sided with Governor DeSantis, effectively preventing felons from voting in November unless they pay off what they owe. But critics fighting for the right to vote say requiring payments is just a twist on old Jim Crow laws.
Yes, that is a poll tax.
Desmond Meade spent 3 years in prison on a drug charge, then went to law school. A federal judge agreed Florida's pay-to-vote system is inherently unfair, writing the overwhelming majority of felons will be unable to pay.
I say that I think that those who don't want people like me to be able to vote are people that, first of all, think that people who have felony convictions are going to vote one particular party over the other, particularly Democrat Party.
Republican State Representative Jamie Grant pushing for a law that clarifies felons must pay back what they owe before they can vote.
You have to ask yourself, are fines and fees part of a sentence in Florida? They indisputably, unequivocally are required by the Florida Constitution. Well, the major thing is the protection of Florida's Constitution.
So you argue constitutionally, but is this argument for you particularly difficult because of your skin color?
Yes. There's no doubt about it that if I looked differently or came from a different background or had a different perspective that gave me credibility in a way that me being a white man in America.
President Trump narrowly won the state by just over 119,000. If felons register, that's a potential 774,000 new voters in a purple state. Florida has the third greatest number of electoral votes.
I think it has a lot to do with the presidential election that's coming up. When you think about the state of Florida, you're talking about a state in which a governor's race was decided by 30,000 votes, a congressional race by 16,000 votes. And when you look at a constituency of people, like returning citizens in Florida, when you talk about 1.4 million people that have the opportunity to be a part of the system, to think about the impact that it would have on presidential elections, of course, would capture anybody's imagination.
Florida State Representative Grant says this is not a red versus blue or black versus white issue.
I think it is absolutely gross to suggest that because somebody is a certain skin color or somebody has committed a felon, that they are going to align with a certain political demographic.
Tonight, a problem. Florida elections officials have kept no records of felons who already registered to vote but have yet to pay back money they owe. Florida is a state with a history of messy elections, potentially headed to more confusion now in November. Kerry Sanders, NBC News, Miami.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here. And click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.